stuff like that. So I
Well,
just,
that's a Crete. It's just sometimes I get behind on what they was in this folder because actually I got it yesterday.
Well, see, if you look at it, I mean, the one guy came over that ran up there, and he held his arms like this, and then the other guy put his arms up and waved it off, and the other guy thought he put it up for a touchdown. So one hit with this, and the other does this, and
All you need is one more guy to like this.
you know, there was Vegas lost $1 billion on the wagers that they had to put out.
it was a lot.
Look, we know it's gonna be after somebody going.
Oh yeah. Somebody's wearing cement shoes.
Yeah. I look at it this way, you know, you hear all those reports about people in Las Vegas. Those two referees may not show up.
They may never be heard from again.
But before the game, the Packers odds were 7-1 to win the Super Bowl. As of now, they bumped them up to 9-1.
Mark, if you emailed us, did you see it too? So I don't know if we're gonna have to, you're gonna have to appoint Mary as secretary or whatever.
Well, very old line is gonna be very old line.
Old life.
They're gonna get together and then we're gonna have this Super Bowl.
Super Bowl stuff.
Now don't take that, don't bet on
The only way they're going to go to the Super Bowl is when they buy tickets and watch it. But they said now that the officials may be on strike now. They figured they could be out there on the field anyway. Yeah, they'll have
Great, thank you.
Because sometimes I do get emails if I don't recognize who it's from.
I can resend it to you. It's not a big deal.
At least you say this guy said when I got in the office this morning, he said,
Okay, so I'm gonna respond to you right now. I'll CC you.
That's fine.
So yeah, I deleted that's five.
It's okay. Hi, Nancy.
Want to show your wife this? Should be able to help you.
Good evening, everyone. This is a regular board meeting this evening, so if there's anyone out in the audience that would like to make public comment regarding either the budget hearing that we're having this evening or any other agenda items, there's a sheet on the back table over there. We kindly ask simply for your name and some contact information in order for us to make a record of that in our records. So we'll begin our meeting here in just a couple of minutes then. Thank you. and stuff, so I just didn't know.
So actually that gives Nikki a chance to get here on time,
Okay.
because she said she couldn't come until 7.
Okay.
So, a little bit after.
I'll just let everybody know out here too.
Okay.
Good evening again, everyone. We're going to delay the beginning of the meeting just a little bit because of what I want to call some misinformation that was posted in the newspaper. It was appointed that the meeting and the business and the public hearing and stuff would be at 7 p.m. instead of 6:30 according to our agenda here. So we're going to delay the public hearing and the beginning of the meeting until 7 o'clock based on what was published in the newspaper. So sorry about that delay, but in order for us to be good with everything in the open meetings issues, we'll delay that until 7 o'clock. So pardon our problems there, but thank you for waiting.
didn't go to 7 o'clock.
That's fine.
I guess they're like, let's hurry it up.
That's fine.
Great, I need a pen.
Can't start till 7 o'clock anyways.
Oh, okay.
Anybody have an extra pen?
This isn't an extra and I need it. Tell you the truth.
Oh, boy, okay. I'll take this one.
See if it works. I don't know how long it's been in here.
Oh, yeah. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe that went away. No? Nope. I'm running out of pens there.
It'll probably work. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Going.
Thank you. Hey, John.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but thank you for being patient with us. I'd like to begin the meeting and call the meeting to order then. So would the secretary please call the roll?
Mr. Brown,
Here.
Mrs. Coletti,
Here.
Mr. Heisel, Mrs. Sanders,
Here.
Mrs. Stockton,
Here.
Secretary here, President Rose.
Here. You stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. On the agenda, we do have a portion here allowed for public comment, although I have not received anything for general comments on the agenda items, so we'll move then directly into the public hearing portion of the agenda. So I need a motion to open the public hearing of the 2012-2013 budget.
Move.
Moved by Mrs. Coletti. Second by Mrs. Stockton. I'm sorry. I know. I do this all the time. But would the secretary please call a roll?
Mrs. Coletti,
Yes.
Mrs. Sanders,
Yes.
Mrs. Stockton,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Secretary yes, President Rose.
Aye. We do have we're open in public hearing, so we're open for public comment in regards to the 2012-2013 budget. I don't know, I think maybe we should allow some minutes here for Mr. Gruce to make some comments first, and then we'll entertain any questions that we have from the audience. So, go ahead, Bob. It's all yours.
Do you want to sit down here, or you can stay here?
I'm afraid if I leave my coffee here, it'd be cold.
Yeah, I think it will. Just be careful. Okay.
Okay, thanks for your patience tonight, for waiting until 7 o'clock. For the few people in the audience that might not know who I am, I'm Robert Gruce. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Business here at Crete Monee School District. I've been with the district for 4 years. I will take you through the budget briefly tonight, some of the highlights, some of the main points of the budget, and then, of course, answer any questions at the end of the presentation. The overall process timeline of the budget, the way it works is school districts have to adopt a budget by September 30th of each year. The budget is what legally authorizes the district to collect and spend funds. We had our tentative budget, according to the law, was approved on August 20th and has been on public display for 38 days. It has to be on display for at least 30 days. So over that time period, the public has a chance to review the budget, look at any of the details. The board has the opportunity to go in further and review all the details. Any questions that come up, we answer those questions for them. Any input we receive, we could incorporate that into the final budget. So, for example, at our last Finance Committee meeting, there were certain changes or increases or decreases in certain accounts that were inputted into the final version of the budget here. The overall process of the budget, the way it works is our district uses a zero-based budgeting. So what that basically means is each year we start from scratch and we build the budget from the ground up. So the process begins in April, ends in September, and pretty much every single line item is reviewed and discussed and put into the budget piece by piece. And what you'll see is we have an approximate operating budget of about $60 million. That $60 million is made up of literally several thousand line items. Those line items are categorized into 72 cost centers. So it's like 72 smaller budgets inside of one big budget. And pretty much there's 35 non-compensation budgets and 37 compensation budgets. So these budgets here are all the salaries and the benefits categorized into the different categories. So salaries and benefits make up 72% of the budget. All other expenses are these other cost centers which we'll go through, and that makes up 28% of the budget. So the way this works is each of the cost centers is allocated funds for necessary expenditures, and then we monitor those expenditures every month throughout the year. And for example, if you look at fiscal year 2012, our budget came in with, it was 99% accurate of what we budgeted. We actually spent 1% less than what was legally budgeted for the school district. So basically, the business office is looking to provide accurate, timely information to the board so that they can make informed decisions on the direction of the district. What I have up here is the 2012 actual results, which we reviewed at our last board meeting last week. You can see that we started the year off with a $16.5 million fund balance, and we had $56 million of revenue, $57 million of expense, and that was a $1.2 million deficit. So we ended fiscal year 2012 with $15.2 million fund balance, which is a 27% fund balance ratio, which the state recommends that you have essentially a 25% fund balance ratio, ideally. You can see for FY12, the deficit was $1.2 million. That was actually $2.5 million worse than FY11. In FY11, we had a $1.3 million surplus. So in FY11, we ended the year with $16.5 million in our fund balance and also had a $1.3 million surplus. We actually had financial recognition from the state. We were in the highest financial category. So what was the change, the $2.5 million swing there? Basically, it was these items down here. The state had cut our funding by about $1.2 million for fiscal year 2012. And then federal stimulus funds had ended halfway through the year of FY12. In 2011, we had a lot of federal stimulus dollars coming into the district, and when that ended in 12, that meant we received about $1.3 million less dollars from the federal government. And then finally, we had about $1.6 million in raises for FY12. So if you break that down, it's about $1 million for union increases, $300,000 for non-union, and our health insurance costs increased about $350,000. Now, coincidentally, the property tax revenue increases were also $1.6 million during FY12. The reason for that was with inflation and new property, that helped our property tax revenue go up. So that essentially offset the raises during that fiscal year. But overall, we had a $1.2 million deficit for this school year that just ended. For 2013, you can see that the new deficit for this fiscal year is $4.1 million. So we're beginning the year with what we ended last year at $15.2 million. Then we have $55 million of revenue, $59 of expense. So that's a $4 million deficit. So we would be planning to end the year with about $11 million of fund balance. So our fund balance ratio would be going down to about 18%. So the question is, why did our deficit decrease $2.9 million between last fiscal year and this fiscal year? The state cut an additional $1.7 million of funding out of our budget this year. We also had raises once again this year. The union received their approximate $1 million in salary and benefit increases. Non-union was about $250,000. Health insurance went up again. Also for this school year, there was about 10 new teaching positions added for about $500,000. And an offset to some of this was we had 15 teachers retire, and they were replaced with newer teachers making less money, so that was almost $1 million savings. So the net increase was about $1.1 million there. And then we had some other increases, including new textbooks we had to buy, transportation, and special education tuition rates increasing. The property tax increases for this year were much lower because inflation was lower this year and there was little to no new property in the district. So property tax revenue only went up by about $700,000. So that increase was obviously not enough to cover all the increases above. So to recap, this legal budget that we're voting on tonight, it has a $4.1 million deficit and with an ending fund balance of about $11 million. So the state funding cuts are really beginning to add up in terms of impacting our operating budgets each year. This right here is a summary of the state cuts that are built into this year's budget. Essentially, the state has frozen the foundation level, which is the number that determines how much general state aid funding school districts receive. That amount has been frozen for 4 years in a row now. If it had been increasing at even a conservative rate of about $100 a year to keep up with inflation, we would be receiving about $1.9 million more dollars of revenue this year alone. General state aid, even at the lower amount, is being cut by 11%. They're prorating general state aid to 89% this year, so that there is a $900,000 loss. Also, transportation funding has been reduced to only about a 55% reimbursement instead of 80%. Alternative education grant funding, Illinois block grants, those are all things of the past. Those grants, they just don't pay out anymore. That's a $700,000 loss. And then also some other items that they're cutting back on add up to a total of $4.4 million. So if the state was funding education at normal levels still before they started making all the cutbacks, based on our expenses versus our revenue, we would actually have like a $300,000 surplus this year. But when we absorb those state cuts, that's why we have the $4.1 million deficit. So, as a result of these types of things, over 80% of districts have a deficit. And Illinois is ranked currently 49 out of 50 states in terms of education funding. And as a result, Illinois school districts rely heavily on local property tax dollars. So when you look at our revenues, so this is where all the revenues that come into the district. In the large blue portion of the pie chart there, that is our property tax revenue. So you can see we get about 63% of all our revenues from property taxes. The other 13% here is general state aid. This 13% is state reimbursements in regards to special education funding. And then the federal government gives us about 9% of our funding. And then this other $1.5 million is other in terms of food service sales, registration fees, miscellaneous grants that we might receive. And so it's a much smaller amount. But you can see the overwhelming majority of our funding is basically property taxes. So I went over the revenue to kind of show you where the money comes in from. Now to talk about the expenditures, what I tried to do was take the entire budget. So our whole budget adds up to about $59.5 million. And it basically falls into these primary categories right here. First, you have your section up here where it's non-personnel cost. So there's no salaries, no benefits in any of these numbers. And then down below is the salaries and benefits. So for example, we have 17% of our expenses come through the ed fund. We spend 4% of our money on operations and maintenance. About 7% of our money is spent on transportation. So those total up to about 28%. And then the remaining percentage comes from salaries and benefits, about 55% for salary and about 17% on benefits. So to first talk about this $10 million figure, these are those cost centers I talked about, the 33 cost centers that I meet with each budget to go line by line. These are all the cost centers in the ed fund. They all add up to the $10 million here. So what I'll do is I'll show you some examples of some of our larger cost centers, some of the items that go into this. And then this is the handout that was up at the table and up here that I gave the board. This is the breakdown of all the cost centers on there. So the first cost center we had was special education. So they're non-salaries, non-benefits, just the money that they pay out in services and supplies. They spend $3.5 million a year. The biggest chunk of that is tuition for students that require highly specialized services. So we have a lot of students that have different disabilities that require specialized services, mostly out of district and at private facilities or public facilities. And we spend about $3.1 million a year on tuition for those services. Also, we have therapy and nursing services that are required for students with disabilities. That's about $300,000. And then that leaves our special ed director about $100,000 to run the entire department for 875 special ed students in terms of training, equipment, software, supplies, and that comprises her entire $3.5 million cost center budget. Food services is the number 2 budget with $1.5 million. Basically what that pays for is we serve over 763,000 meals per year. So that the breakdown of that, it's about $1.97 per meal that it costs. You know, the overall average. 70% of our lunches served are free meals, and 84% of our breakfasts served are free meals. And we have, so you know, the breakdown of the supplies and the ingredients to cook and produce all these meals for all the students each day. And then that leaves about $100,000 once again to run the entire department in terms of equipment, safety supplies, training, uniforms, menus that go out to the parents, all those types of things. Yes. Right. Right. Well, the $1.97 per meal is just if you took their entire budget in terms of all this money they're spending below on the different ingredients, and then you add their overhead. So the $1.5 million divided by 763,000 meals. So depending on the menu, some meals are cheaper to produce than other meals. Breakfast is usually cheaper to produce than lunch. But the overall average is about $1.97, which is lower than what the federal reimbursement rates are. So that would show you that, you know, we're being efficient. Curriculum, you know, I worked with Laura and tried to list off, you know, their main initiatives, their main programs that they're implementing on a daily basis across the district. And this is what their curriculum budget primarily pays for. So the $1.4 million that goes to curriculum are for things for like textbooks, the Prairie State program, all our district assessment programs, implementing the new Common Core standards, just basically all of our instructional materials, smart boards, all the different things that we put into the classroom come out of Laura's budget here. The number 4 cost center, I'm going through the top 5 here, is technology. We spend about $800,000 a year on technology. And essentially that's just the district investing in technology. That's us doing our computer rotations across the district. So the teachers, you know, they get their new laptops, administrators, all their computer labs, support staff, the computers that they work on. Those district computers get rotated every so many years. Also just our overall infrastructure in terms of, you know, high-speed and wireless internet access, our phone systems, our servers, our operating systems up top there in terms of Skyward, which is the operating system that we run, basically our finance, HR, student database, everything runs off of that. And then, of course, supplies like laptop batteries, keyboards, phones, and projector bulbs. The list just goes on and on of all the things that need to be bought to support the classrooms. Then the last cost centers we'll go through just as an example. The superintendent's office has a budget of about $292,000 this year. But if you look, I mean, basically $200,000 of that is spent on legal fees. So obviously the district attorney gets involved with contract negotiations and different legal matters that come up throughout the year. And so we have to budget about $200,000 for attorney fees. The other $92,000 is basically for various district conferences, trainings, and events. And then another cost center, like something that people wouldn't think about, but we spend about $293,000 a year just on our district copiers. So what that is that's our agreement we have, where we have about 45 large copy machines throughout all the 10 buildings and about 150 desktop printers. And we produce about 20 million copies a year across the district. And so, the cost of producing all those copies and those prints comes up to about $293,000 a year. So what we just went through was this first category, the $10 million. So about 17% of the budget is in this ed fund category here. The next two that I'll quickly go through is operations and maintenance and transportation. So you'll see that O&M spends about $2.5 million a year. Basically, that's just operating and maintaining all of our buildings. We have 10 plus buildings consisting of over 1 million square feet. We have 240 acres of grounds and fields to maintain. And the utility bills alone on all of our buildings are about $1 million a year. So after we spend about $1 million on heating bills and light bills and water bills, the other $1.5 million is our supplies and materials to basically maintain and clean and keep our buildings in compliance. In transportation, we spend about $4.1 million a year. That is basically to safely and efficiently transport over 4,800 students over 1 million miles a year that we transport our students in our district. So we have a very large district in terms of land mass. It's 80 square miles. So in a given year, our transportation routes are over 1 million miles a year. And basically, our route package and our contract are very efficient in terms of we have our routes streamlined to minimize the number of buses that we need. And then also our new contract that we just put in place for this last fiscal year, we're saving about $1 million a year on our transportation contract as compared to the previous contract, because we went out to bid and we had several vendors give us bids, and we really tightened up our bid specs. And the pricing that we received from this new bid was phenomenal in terms of the rates being much lower. So that's a good thing that's helping us out right now. So we went through the 10 million, the 2.5, and the 4. So basically that's the entire operating budget except for the salaries and the benefits. So the next section that I'll go through will just be the salaries and the benefits. So you can see we spend $33 million a year on salaries and $9.8 million on benefits. So the way that breaks down is, now these are the other cost centers I talked about. We break our salaries and benefits into cost centers as well. So you have this top section where it's basically 671 positions in the district. So these are 671 individual jobs that are across the district that people have. And the different categories are listed here. You can see, obviously, the largest category is going to be teachers with about 305. And then we have 37 administrators in the district. And then different categories like administrative support, teacher assistants, specialists, which are like speech pathologists, psychologists, those types of employees. And then our O&M department, 50, that's 40 custodians and 10 maintenance people. Food service, and then finally security. And then there's this other dollar amount, so that adds up to a total of about $37 million. And then there's this other category of about $5 million, which I'll go through. So first, to look at our 671 positions. So like I said, you can see in the dark blue there, those are the teachers, about 46.5%. And then about 10% of our employees are administrators. Some examples of administrators would be like our administrative deans, athletic director, assistant superintendent, assistant principals, division leaders. Those make up pretty much the 37 people. In terms of teachers, we have 65 special education teachers and 240 regular teachers. And the specialists, like I mentioned, those are job coach, psychologists, social workers, speech path. those types of workers. The administrative support, that's kind of a vague description. There's 73 people. That looks like a really high number, but basically that is like your business office, your HR office, all the computer techs, our administrative assistants, our building secretaries, transportation department, student affairs. So it's several, employees that make up that group that basically support the classrooms and the infrastructure of the district. So that's the breakdown of all of our positions, 671. And the next category, this is that other category, where this is about $5 million. So $5 million is a huge number to just be, as other. So we break these all down into specific cost centers that are all tracked as well. And you can see like some examples. The biggest one on top are like substitute teachers. So every day there's, whenever teachers have to call in sick or they have to go to a training or they're not available to be in their classroom, we have to hire a substitute teacher to watch that classroom. We spend about $788,000 a year on substitute teachers. Student supervision is about $446,000. That's lunch duty and bus duty, just supervising the students while, at those times of the day. Then we have our clubs, all the different activities that they can join of $439,000. Athletics is about $392,000. Those are just some of the main items. Once again, this is on the handout that you have. These are the different categories of expenses that we need to plan for and budget for and keep track of each year. And pretty much, so now we've gone through the entire operating budget, sort of in a summary format, but very line by line, so you get a good idea of each and everything that we're spending our money on each year. The other thing to talk about are our non-operating funds. These funds it's basically debt service, capital projects, and fire prevention and safety. What that is you can see debt service here. We have about $10.5 million of bond payments that we have to make. That's just our long-term debt, paying down the debt that we issued to build this high school and to build the new Monee Elementary and to make the expansions to the middle school. That was, $60, $70 million of bonds that were sold to build all these buildings, and that's paid off over 20 years. So that's the payments on that. And then the capital projects and fire prevention and safety are for different capital projects that are going on in the district. Like life safety, for example, is where we pay for many of our asbestos abatement projects in the older schools that have to remove asbestos in a proactive way so that you don't have to worry about that later. Right, right. It would have been significantly lower. I think we were probably ramping down towards, like for example, if you look into the future, I think it's 2020 sometime when this debt is coming due. You pretty much get it paid off, and your debt service would go down essentially almost to zero. But usually what happens is by that time we may need to be building another school. Everything's kind of on a cycle. So ideally, if you're able to build your schools and then pay them off and then have everything paid off and not have to build anything for several years, you can keep that debt service amount really low. And that would be like, somebody that, when you're trying to budget your checkbook at home, and if you don't have a mortgage payment to pay, that frees up a lot of money for other things. Now, keep in mind, though, the debt service, all three of these funds are completely separate from the operating funds. So in terms of debt service, the way that works is the bonds are sold, and then property taxes are levied specifically to pay off that debt. So the amount of debt that is due is the exact amount of property taxes that are levied by the county because they know that we have these bonds that were sold. So essentially, if the debt goes away, then that levy goes away. Right. Well, I mean, the answer to that is basically just interest. So that money is borrowed. You borrowed about 82 million, and that was borrowed back in 2004 when interest rates were pretty high. I believe the interest on this debt is around 7%. And when you pay it over time, you know, just like a mortgage, if you buy a house for $200,000, you probably pay $400,000 in mortgage payments over 30 years. Same idea here. You borrow $80 million to build all these schools, and then over the 20 years, you probably pay back close to $200 million because you're paying $80 million in principal and probably $100 million in interest. So, I mean, that's the drawback to having to finance things is you have to pay the interest expense. Yeah. Ideally, what we would want to do is we would want to refinance all this debt right now because interest rates are as low as they're ever going to be. The only downside is that when this debt was, when we entered into this debt back in 2004, what we did was it's basically called non-callable debt, and what that means is that you're basically telling an investor that, okay, give me $80 million worth of bonds, and we're going to pay you back over the next 20 years at 7% interest. And so that you give us a lower interest rate, we'll guarantee that we won't refinance this. So you know it's a guaranteed investment that you're going to have for 20 years. And the reason that the district did that at the time was they were getting a lower interest rate by going into this non-callable debt. So, for example, if it was callable debt, meaning you could refinance it later, they might have been paying 8 or 9%. So they went with the non-callable debt, which was at about 7%, which seemed like a good deal at the time. But the unfortunate thing is, you know, if everyone had a crystal ball, it'd be a lot easier. But you know, several years later, now interest rates are at 1 and 2%, and you wish you could refinance, but you can't now. So that's, you know, you're basically just kind of stuck with paying those rates over. It's just a set mortgage that you can't really get out of. No, and I know because like Elizabeth Hennessy that comes to talk to us about all our financing options, and we, you know, I just bring it up every time, even though she's already given me the answer several times. But in terms of, you know, is there anything we can do to kind of get out of this old debt deal that we have at 7% interest? Because I mean, it's frustrating when you see interest rates are at 2% right now for long-term debt. You know, bonds, municipal bonds are 1-2%. You wish you can get out of it and refinance it, but it's basically an agreement, a commitment that the district entered into several years ago that you can't get out of at this point. Well, that's part of the deal of it being non-callable. You can't really. That would be essentially refinancing it. You know, you could say, let's say if our balance that was still due was still another $70 million, we could borrow $70 million of bonds at 2%, and then take that money and pay off this expensive debt over here, and then pay back the 2%. That would be refinancing it essentially. But you know, with it being non-callable, we can't do that. Basically, part of the deal of getting the lower rate at the time was guaranteeing that investor that you're not going to pay it off early and essentially end their investment that they have in place. Uh-oh. So I think I'm on my last slide now. Sure. Okay. Okay. Right. Sure. So what we have is substitute teachers. We know what that is. We talked about student supervision, bus duty, noon duty stuff. all our clubs and activities they could join. This is 1% contingency. Essentially what that is that every year we build literally 1% of our salary. We put an amount equal to 1% as contingency into the budget. For example, at our last board meeting, we had to hire some more teachers because of enrollment increases. That is what that contingency will be used for. That's right here. So we're at 411. Going down with athletics. This number here, this is overtime and additional help over the summer for summer projects and different things that we need to do over the summer to do all our projects for O&M. High school 6 assignments, what that is that we schedule, several teachers will teach a 6th class. So basically every teacher would have 5 classes a day to teach, and these are teachers that teach a 6th class so that we don't have to hire additional teachers. They just kind of do one extra class, and then we could avoid by hiring more teachers by having some 6 assignments. TRS for federally funded salaries, any funds that are any federal funds, federal grants that pay for teachers, when you do that, you have to pay 23.8% into TRS, into the teacher's retirement system. So that's additional. So it's a good thing to get a grant to pay for a teacher, a federal grant to pay for a teacher. The drawback to that is that we then have to pay a 28% penalty essentially to the state, because they're saying, since the federal government's paying for that teacher for you, we're not going to pay into that pension. You're going to pay the whole thing into the pension. So that's what that line item is for. Claims to exceed premiums is essentially we have our health rates set for the given year, and the way it works is according to the actuaries based on those premiums. So let's say it's $500 a month to have the insurance plan. When you collect all the premiums, it should equal the amount of claims that you pay out. I mean, that's how they set the premiums. And what happens is a lot of the times you collect, let's say, $2 million in premiums, and you have $2.2 million in claims, health claims that come in. So we need to budget for that, because that's happened the last 3 years now. So I don't want to not have that budgeted in there, because our health claims have been high for the last 3 years. So what we set aside is, because we have a self-funded health plan with, there's like an insurance policy, there's a cap. So the way it works is we collect premiums from all the employees and pay in the benefits into a fund. And then we have a separate insurance policy that says if there's a really bad claim, once a claim hits $100,000, a second level of insurance pays that off. So the worst claim we can get is $100,000, but all the claims under $100,000, when anybody goes to the doctor, we pay for that claim. And so essentially, by the time when you collect all the premiums versus all the claims you pay out, in theory, based on the actuaries, how they come up with the premiums that they come up with. So next month we'll be discussing our health rates, what they're going up to account for, they look at history, they look at all the claims history, and based on that claims history, they set a premium. What has happened in the last couple of years is that they set that premium, we collect all the money, but at the end of the year, there's more claims to pay out than money that came in. So what I'm doing here is I'm budgeting for that. Now, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that for this school year, it levels off and is break even, it's zero. But I would predict that it's going to be about $200,000 over. Stipends and assignments those are various, those are mostly curriculum, I think professional development type assignments, where basically if teachers stay after the workday to get more professional development, in their contract we have to pay them a certain amount per hour to do that. So that's money set aside for those types of events. Retirement incentive payments, what that is in the current contract, when teachers retire, they receive basically an annual stipend for a set amount of years after they're retired. And if they're with the district for a set amount of time and they give the district sufficient notice, when they retire, they'll receive payments after being retired for I think it's up to 5 years. So we have, especially now that we just had 15 teachers retire, we need the budget for that line item here. TRS retirement cost is essentially every year there's usually 1 or 2 teachers that elect the early retirement option, which is through the state law and the state pension. If you have a certain number of years and you're a certain age, you can retire early. You just have to pay a penalty. The employee pays the penalty, but the employer pays a very large penalty as well. And we have to allow 10% of the eligible members to elect that option. So there's really no way to deny it. And so when these different teachers want to retire early, you know, one teacher retiring early could cost us $120,000. I mean, we just get the bill from TRS and we have to pay for that. So we budget and plan for that. Vacation cash outs these are vacation days that are not used by employees. We were trying to we have a lot of employees from the past that haven't used vacation days year after year after year, and we're trying to pay those down to get them down back to a normal balance, because we can't let that type of liability just accrue year after year. So we're putting a system in place where people essentially have to use their vacation days, but in order to get them caught up, we have to pay them off for past days that they've earned in past years. And then let's see, quickly, horizontal movement, $100,000. What that is teachers will turn in their transcripts and show that they received a master's degree or more education. And then in October, we'll adjust their salary accordingly, according to the contract. You got a master's degree, okay, now you get a raise. And so each year there's about $100,000 of raises that result from teachers that went to school and got more credit hours. PPS 6 assignments, these are special ed teachers that take on a 6th assignment. Retiree sick day cash outs. Okay. Yeah, the middle school 6 assignments, those are just middle school teachers that take on a 6 assignment. Yeah. Okay. Right. 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 It's a mixture. Some of the teachers we brought in they have master's degrees, maybe 6 or 7 years experience. Some of the teachers that we brought in, I think, maybe only had 1 or 2 years experience. I think on the average, they're probably a couple years experience. So usually a newer teacher that we hire to replace someone that retired, we usually bring them in at about half the cost, half the salary. Because once a teacher is in the district for over 30 years, they're making a really high salary. And then you could bring somebody in with even 3 or 4 years experience and they'll only make half as much. So when we had all those teachers retire at the end of last school year, we actually saved almost $1 million in salary right there. Right.
So I saw, at least on some of the items that we saw, the number of 6 assignments. So what's the comparison? Are there 10 teachers for every 6 assignment? How do you see the savings?
I would say, I'm trying to think, I think a 6 assignment is, do you know, Dr. Edison, is it $6,000 is the? Okay. A semester. So you'd be looking at, so if it's $6,000, that would be, seven 6 Right. So the whole year is about 6,000 or 7,000. So if you assumed an average starting salary of a teacher would be about 42,000, you'd be looking at, once you got to about 6 or 7 6 assignments, you'd almost be at the cost of just hiring a teacher. But then, of course, once you factor in the benefits, that would probably be additional money. So I'd say anywhere between 7 to 9 6 assignments would, at that point, you could just hire a teacher. But I think the thing with the 6 assignments they're more flexible, so you could do one here and one here and one at that time, one at this time. whereas you maybe can't take those 7 classes and just lump them all together to one teacher, because it might be different subjects. So it's basically a flexibility thing that you can help fill in the gaps where you need them without having to hire more teachers than you need. This chart shows, this is almost the last slide here, 2006 through 2013. So you can see in 06 and 07, we had pretty healthy fund balances. So we were here about 11 million, 15 million. So you can see up here our fund balance is pretty high. We had surpluses going. And then in 2008, 2009, we decided, we started spending our fund balances down. And you can see we had a $4 million deficit and then a $6 million deficit. You can see the fund balance being spent down very rapidly. And 2009 is when it became very alarming that if we have a $6.5 million deficit and only a $4.5 million fund balance. And at that time, a lot of planning went into place, and the board strategically decided to cut over 100 positions in the district and sell $15 million of working cash bonds. And what you could see what that did was all the cuts here eliminated that enormous deficit. So we went from 6 million, 5 million back to a surplus. And then you can see the fund balance go back from down around 4.5 million back up to 16.5 million with the new debt that we sold. So in 2011, we were doing pretty good. We had balanced our budget. We had a surplus. We had a large fund balance. Financially, we were pretty much probably in the best shape the district's ever been in. And then in 2012, 2013, like we talked about earlier, basically what happened was now that we got all caught up, we got where we wanted to be, the state just started handing down cut after cut after cut, and it just seems to never end. So that's where we are now. We're falling behind again with a $4 million deficit. And like I had, like we talked about, basically that entire deficit is caused by the $4.5 million of state cuts that we have in our budget right now. So in terms of the financial future, having a $4 million deficit, but over $4 million of it is from state cuts. The only problem is these, I would have to say that these cuts are probably more likely permanent rather than temporary. I don't see the state suddenly restoring all this funding overnight because they just don't have, they're not going to have the money. With the problems they have with Medicaid and pensions and their bond ratings, at best, I think they'll keep funding at the current levels. So with that being said, it's important for the board and the community to understand the details behind the budget, but more importantly, our 5-year forecast that we look at, 3 times a year, and basically like we covered it, and we talked about it in May, and we talked about it in June again in terms of our 5-year forecast. And there's a few things that are happening in the next couple years that even if we don't make any cuts, start to stabilize the budget. We're not going to keep a $4 million deficit. We couldn't do that. But over the next couple of years, a few things happen. First of all, next year, starting in FY14, we'll have an opportunity to stabilize our compensation growth, meaning lower raises, less benefits that we give out. We can't continue to, like you see on the slides where I said, okay, this year we had another $1.5 million of raises, and then next year another $1.5 million of raises. We have to slow that amount down because basically your increases in revenue are the only things that will pay for those raises. And if revenue's not going up, you can't be increasing it as much. So that's probably the most important thing. The other things here are property tax revenue will continue to grow under the current tax laws. Basically, it grows by whatever the rate of inflation is. So this year, I think inflation it's around 2% again this year. So it's not a great year, but it's not like a few years ago when it was basically down at 0%. And then also, the other most important thing is that you need to look at general state aid. The district's EAV is, if you look at the numbers, it's falling about 37% between 2010 and 2015. So that's saying that your average home in the community is going down by that percentage over the course of 5 years. At the same time, the poverty counts in the community are going up. And then also, we're making the assumption that the state would stop prorating general state aid at 89% and fund it back to 100% at some point by 2016. And when I say that, we're keeping the foundation level frozen for basically for eternity, which would mean that it should be reasonable that they fund the amount by 100%. So these three things, what this means is general state aid should go up based on these three factors. Property taxes, the revenue from that should be going up. And then if raises are not growing as fast as they are, you put those three things together, and basically in our 5-year forecast, you'll see that next year's budget should be around a $3 million deficit, and then it improves to about $1 million deficit, and by 16 it should be about a $1 million surplus. And that's with making no cuts, no changes in the current budget. We discussed a set of recommendations that essentially they weren't cuts to current items, but they were items that we maybe would not add to the budget that are currently planned. So it would be not increasing costs, just keeping things more like how they are now. And based on those recommendations, FY14 could be as good as only $1 million deficit. And then by 15, we could have essentially a balanced budget. And by 2016, hopefully, possibly even a $3 million surplus. With that being said, though, it is extremely important for everyone to understand that there's still a few serious risks out there in terms of the three big things are the state pension reform, which is going to take place probably after January. They're going to reform the pension system. And what that means is one of the proposals is that they would push the cost of the state pensions to the local taxpayers and to the local school districts. So essentially they would take a $2 million bill at the state level, say that they can't afford it anymore, and then make us pay for that. So obviously that would devastate our budget. Healthcare legislation is going to have a large impact on our budget within the next couple of years. When different provisions come into place, there's more likely than not going to be a lot of people that currently don't take our benefits will be coming onto our benefits, and that's going to dramatically increase our costs as well. And then also, if all these assumptions come true, like I said, our forecast looks good. The only problem is something I would caution is that a big part of this assumption is that general state is going to go up. These figures are all based on the current general state aid formula, which is written into state law. And the state has done this in the past, and I'm sure they'll do it again in the future, where they could change how the law works and say that, well, even though EAV is going down, and even though your poverty counts are higher, we're going to change how the formula works, and now we're just not going to give you the money. So if they keep the rules how the rules are set now, we should be okay. But if they go and change the rules, that's something you can't really account for that. You can't really plan for that right now. But you could be aware of it and just realize, like for example, there's been people that have been trying to pass new laws that say when property values are going down that there wouldn't be any tax increases to the school district. So I mean that sounds good in theory, but like I showed before, the most reliable source of revenue and our biggest source of revenue are property taxes. So if they go and pass a law like that could be over the course of 10 years, that could cost us tens of millions of dollars. So there's different laws that they can enact that could change these assumptions and make these assumptions not come true. So that's a major risk. So pretty much we went into it in pretty good detail tonight. If there's any more questions, I could answer those now, or you could also contact me anytime, and I can go into this several hours of detail. You could just keep digging deeper and deeper. But if there's no more questions, that's all I have for tonight.
And we're going see me 10 years from now.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Mr. Gruss for quite I find it enjoyable presentation. Some of the things that we were just talking about are, even though they're in summary form and stuff, there's some very good information there where I think that the understanding of all the various line items and the funds that we have to account for every year are presented. So I find it good, and again, thanks, Bob, for the very enlightening presentation. We still are in an open public hearing, so I'd like to offer to any members of the public, if they'd like to speak about the about the budget that was just presented. At this time, I'd like to have that happen. Anybody care to do anything like that? Okay, go ahead. I think I'll let Mr. Gruss answer that. He's done quite a bit of study and has quite a bit of history on trends of the property values and things like that, I think, that you're concerned about. So,
I mean, under the way the property tax laws currently work, even though property values are going down, or if poverty counts are going higher, it's a set. I mean, it's a property tax limitation law. When they put it into place, it essentially was when housing prices were going up 10 or 15% a year, and what it said was, because then at that time, then that meant that our property tax revenues went up 10 or 15% a year, and they said, well, that's too much. So the way it's going to work now is the amount that your property tax revenue will go up will be it'll be 5% or CPI, whichever is lower, and CPI is basically inflation. So inflation's never been 5% in a given year. So it's always whatever inflation is. So if you go back to the last few levies, there was one levy where it was actually 4.5%. So we got a huge increase in property tax revenue. Then the next year it was down to it was basically 0%. So we got no increase at all. And then it was at about 2%, and then 1.5%. If you look at a historical average over 20 years, it averages like 2%. But it's usually either like 1 or 3. But that's the average, is about 2%. So in our 5-year forecast, what we assume is that inflation will be 2.5%. And based on that inflation amount, and based on how the property tax laws work, we would get increases in our property tax revenue. However, like I said, they can change how that law works. They can say, well, now we're going to do it differently. Now we're going to do it this way or that way. And depending on your district and your circumstances, that could be a good thing or a bad thing for you. But, I mean, one thing I noticed in the last 4 years of working in school finance is that, I mean, they pass new laws. It's like on a daily basis. You have to keep track of what they're changing. But, something like a property tax law, that's a pretty substantial major law, and it would take a lot for them to change it, but it's still a possibility. So I just like to put it out there to say, it's likely we'll get these increases if based on how the rules work now. If you project the numbers going forward, this is what will happen. But always keep in mind that things could change. They could change on how the laws work, and if that were to happen, that could adversely affect the district.
Bob,
I think she also mentioned the poverty. Would you again the significance of the increase in the poverty counts?
Right. So the Department of Human Services, pretty much through people that will qualify for different assistant programs, you know, they go into the system of the Department of Human Services, and they're able to generate for the state of Illinois, you know, by town, what percentage of the residents, how many residents in that area are basically considered in, you know, according to the definition, in poverty. And so it's basically, it's called like the district's poverty count. And so we'll say, okay, in this area there's 3,000 people that need, you know, different assistant programs. Now if that amount goes up, now it's 4,000. In the general state aid formula, there's a part of the formula that is directly tied to that number. And when that number goes up, you automatically get more money from the state then. They basically, it's built into the current formula, you know, so basically if it's a more poor community, the state helps that community more rather than a community that doesn't have any poverty. Well, then they don't allocate any funds to that community. They'll go to the community that needs it more. So our most recent poverty count went up dramatically by several, you know, 10% or so. And that gave us a big jump in state funding that we were getting. And it's based on like a 3-year average. So now that jump, that 1-year jump is going to be built into that 3-year average over the next 3 years, and it's going to keep expanding the amount of money that they're going to give us through general state aid due to that one number collected by the Department of Human Services. However, like I said, again, that's something that they could say, you know, well, now poverty counts are going up everywhere, and we just don't have the money to keep giving to all these communities, so now we're going to change that. And maybe now we don't give you, you know, that separate grant for that. I mean, it's possible they could cut something like that. But, you know, it hasn't been cut yet. There haven't been any talks to do that. But when the state is in as bad financial condition as they are, it's something they might look into in the future. I mean, it trickles down in terms of, you know, if the federal government's having issues, then they can't give as much money to the states, and the states can't give as much money to the school districts, and then, you know, they kind of shift the burden around. You know, the state's going to balance their budget by pushing costs onto the local taxpayers. Well, that's not going to help anybody because now the state has a balanced budget, but now your property taxes go up because now you have to pay for the state's pensions that they don't pay for anymore. So they're just shifting the problem around between basically different levels of government. You either push it up to the federal government and they push it down to the local government. Right. Yeah, if there's money in a cost center, if we budget $500,000 for something, and we only use $400,000, that $100,000 stays in the bank. It's not used. It just stays in the fund balance. And basically, you know, we would come back and say, well, we budgeted to spend X amount, but like we did in fiscal year 2012, we had budgeted to spend a certain amount. We only spent 99% of that. So 1%. Which equates to, you know, quite a bit of money when you're talking about a $60 million budget, that stayed in the fund balance. So the deficit wasn't as large as it would have been. The deficit was smaller than it had been planned to be. So that money stays in the fund balance and then rolls into the next year. Well, like for example, I think we're starting this year with $15.2 million, and then our budget is to have a $4.1 million deficit. So if that comes to be, we'll have about $10.9 million left in our fund balance at the end of the year. Now let's say if the deficit ends up only being $4 million instead of 4.1, at the end of the year our fund balance will have $11 million instead of 10.9. So, yeah, right. Right. It stays in. All it is it's just like if you have $20 in your pocket and you plan to go to the grocery store and spend $20, and when you go there, you end up only spending 18. Instead of having zero in your pocket when you leave, you'll have $2 in your pocket. So that's all we're saying is if you're starting, we're saying that we're going to start with X amount, and then we think we're going to spend so much. If we don't spend all that, well, that's just more money that stays in the bank. I mean, the money literally is just sitting in the bank right now, and if we spend more money than we take in, then that bank account balance is gonna decrease. What you hope to do is the amount of money you spend, you hope that you find enough revenue to match it, and just keep that bank balance the same every year, and just keep it and never touch it, and just have it there in case. It's a reserve, yes. The fund balances are reserves. Right, right. But if you have too many deficits in a row, that balance starts to decrease until it's gone, and then that's not a good situation to have.
You know, the analogy I'd like to use is savings account, checking account. The district's annual budget is the checking account, and if you're running a deficit, you're drawing eventually once you spend more than what you have in the checking account. Your savings account is covering, you know, the deficit. So if you don't spend the money, now directly to your question, if I have $400,000 in my checking account, and let's say I'm already running a potential deficit of $100,000, but there's several places I don't spend, that'll be just more money in my checking account. Otherwise, yeah, in a sense it goes against the deficit because I won't have as deep of a hole. But at the end of the year, if you have any money left in that checking account, it goes over to savings to start the process all over again as far as your fund balances. Is that a good analogy, Bob?
That's good, yeah.
Okay, that passed? All right.
Okay. Do I have any other questions at all from any of the public out there on any of the budget there? If not, then I'd like to entertain a motion to close the public hearing regarding the budget.
Move.
Moved by Mrs. Coletti,
Second.
second by Mrs. Stockton. Would Secretary please call a roll?
Mrs. Sanders?
Aye.
Mrs. Stockton?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye. I'm like,
Mrs. Coletti?
Aye.
Secretary I. President Rose?
Aye. Public hearing then for the budget is now closed. We will be having some question and answer possibly in the action reports that follow up in one of the next following agenda items. Do we have a need to go into closed session at all? No closed session, and we'll begin the business portion of the meeting here. I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented in our agenda packet.
Moved.
Moved by Mrs. Stockton. Second by Mr. Brown. You have questions or comments in regards to the consent agenda?
It's the law, correct?
No questions or comments at all from members?
I just made the comment that it is obviously the law that we have to provide, or report, rather, the administrator and teacher salaries, so that this is not an option, and this is for every year. We don't have an option in this. This is just
No,
something we,
it's required by school code every year to present that.
so,
And that's published in public records throughout various websites and newspapers and things like that that you can visit. So, and I believe even on our website too, so.
well, it's actually sort of new, and Dr. Edison can correct me on the date if I'm wrong on this. A couple years ago, it was, the only requirement was administrators had to be reported, but I think just, what is it, last year, Dr. Edison? The law passed on
Yes,
that?
this portion of the law went into effect in January of this year.
Right.
So the initial law had just for administrative salaries to be reported, and with the understanding that eventually both administrators and teacher salaries would be reported and published. And this portion just went into effect in January 1st.
Right, so this is the first time then, actually, that this report has been made public that includes teachers and administrators for this year.
Yes.
Yes.
And so the requirement then is similar and/or is the same? We have to, because I remember when the initial administration list, of course it is in the newspaper and that such, but we would post this on our website?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the only thing I will say that the law doesn't require, you, the board, has access to actual names, but the law does not require that names are published when we have to put it on the website, just the position and the salaries.
Okay.
So we don't have to publish. We've given you the courtesy because we know that you might want to have some names to look at, so we gave that to the board. But by law, we don't have to divulge that information to the public as far as the name.
So essentially, and just somebody saying, I wonder how much they pay an English teacher at the high school, hypothetically. And I don't know why somebody would be so interested in that, but let's say we're paying English teachers, or the record says we're paying English teachers $200,000. Hypothetically, I said. But with that, and I guess just even as a parent, saying you pay $200,000, or let's be more realistic, $95,000, in comparison to the improvements, and especially with this new Common Core process, the salary, does it commiserate with what someone is getting paid versus, because you mentioned it out there, or Bob did, we have newer teachers who are not getting paid necessarily what our more tenured people are. And even in a budget hearing such as this, maybe somebody would be, I know it would be scary, I think you were maybe leading to this, could be scary to have a bunch of brand-new people, and we're looking at savings as well as perhaps, I would say, some new skill sets, some bringing out some fresh new ideas is not the worst thing, but at the same time, districts have to cut at every level, at every point, even at the salary level, right?
It's not, again, I'll just let Dr. Edison, I don't want, Dr. Edison, would you answer that question? I believe I know what your answer is going to be, but go ahead and answer this.
I think if you look kind of at the history of the legislation, this came from current governor, and in an effort to have full disclosure of public workers. And if you look throughout the public sector, salaries are being published. And so this was just the next step. The initial step was with just administrative salaries and benefits. And this is just the second step of it. So now all of the teachers will be as well.
I will say this, though, in direct to English. The law doesn't require us to break it down to that point, as far as it's really just a very generic teacher, administrator, teacher, administrator. So what the public can derive from that is they can see the range of salaries in the teacher category, from the lowest salary to the highest salary, and they can also come up with an aggregate average, meaning they wanted to know on average how much do we pay our teachers. They could probably do the calculation and do that. It's not broken down by school, it's not broken down by department, because again, the law just says you have to list all of your teachers, all of their salaries, all your administrators, all their salaries, and some benefit categories, and that's it. Now, if I'm sure that if the public FOIA'd the request of, again, I don't know why they would want to know just our English department or our math department, but if they wanted that information, and if a report exists as such internally, then we would have to give them that information. But this particular report, it's a pretty straightforward list of just all your teachers, all your administrators, and their salaries and benefits, without categorizing it any further.
Right. The specific titles are not required.
Yeah.
But when we saw you got administrative salaries in the newspaper, 2 years ago, they named individuals. Where did they obtain that information?
They could have FOIA'd that information, because that is
So it
free
wasn't
information.
openly. Okay.
Right, but that's different from what we are required to publish.
Okay.
Yeah, they can get the names, but they'll have to go through a few more hoops to get them. We just don't have to provide them, at least not on the first round out. We're basically saying if you want names, you're going to have to request it, because the law doesn't require us to give names, and that's just for a lot of reasons why I think you would probably understand why we don't want to have a name to everything.
And there are also other databases online where people can get information and
Yeah.
names.
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
Dr. Edison.
Since we're a unit district, you have to have an understanding of how the various districts are broken up. So they're broken, the salaries are based on the total revenue that's brought into a particular area, and then it's also based upon the type of school district. So unit districts vary as far as their salaries, because everybody's under the same salary schedule. Traditionally, elementary districts paid a little less than high school districts, and there's some historical stuff on that I won't go into. But traditionally, that's just been the way that it's been. So our high school salaries are somewhat lower than some of our surrounding high school salaries, some of our surrounding high schools. However, our elementary salaries are right in the middle or slightly higher than some of our elementary-only districts in our surrounding areas. So it's kind of a mixture, because we are a pre-K through 12 school district.
Okay. Do I have any other questions at all from any other members? If not,
I do have a
Okay,
question,
go ahead.
Mark. Looking at the personnel report, I had a question about the educational support staff employment. I noticed there is a new person in the 21st Century Grant Coordinator position, replacing another employee, but I don't see where the other employee went, and if this was already expressed, I'm sorry.
Are you looking on page
Page
22?
22, yes.
Again, Dr. Edison, he knows the answer. I do too, but it's Dr. Edison's report.
The position was open because the person who was in the position previously accepted another position, which caused the opening for that position. So she was moved into another position.
So
Okay.
just for clarification, in school terminology or education, you guys, is that considered a person's, it's not something that we would need to approve? You've laterally moved someone into a position? Is that how I'm understanding? Because in other words, I'm trying to figure out why wouldn't that individual's name be in the position that they've assumed, and then say they've been replaced by such and such? What's the reason for the exclusion of the individual?
That person was moved and was on a previous
On the last-
personnel
on the- yeah.
report,
Okay.
and so that was had already been
So
approved.
it doesn't need to be reiterated?
Right. I mean, we could put it on. I don't think there was any intent one way or the other of it not being included, but
No,
it
but
had
just
already
to
been
know.
had already been approved.
Yeah, just so you'll know, the history is the original position, without getting into names, someone resigned, and so someone internally applied for the position and got it, and then their position came open, and so the person you see tonight applied for their vacant position, and so this person is replacing the person who took someone else's position who had resigned. So that's how it happened.
Right. Now, we do have the name of the person who was replaced, but that person was on a previous board packet that we had, that position was filled earlier, so she was on a previous board report, personnel report, and was approved.
And in the previous personnel report, it wouldn't have showed who,
It would
yeah,
have
it would have showed who
she
she
was replacing.
replaced. That's
Yes.
right, okay.
Yes.
And refresh my memory, Tony, this position is part-time?
It's not a part-time position, but it's based upon a grant that has a timetable on the grant. So there's a possibility that if the grant doesn't continue, then the position will go away.
So the person that held it previously, was it 2 positions? Wasn't it 2?
No, it was just.
The
it was
person
just
that
the
held
one-
it before-
one position.
Wasn't it 2 positions?
Not to my knowledge. I thought it was
Okay.
just the 20th century grant position. The 20th century grant coordinator.
And because the, because the grant is tentative or possibly being eliminated, the difference in the, how do you, how do I say that? How do you justify, or is there a need, how do you justify the difference in, because if my memory serves me, the salary is definitely, there's a variance. So is it now, because, I do remember this, is it now that the grant money, we're not putting in additional funds, because that's what it was. We were putting in some additional funds to this grant for the previous, or this person's predecessor. So now we're not doing that, and most likely, how would we explain that?
The amounts that are budgeted for, that we are currently budgeting for the grant itself does not include, it's only the money that's from the grant. So it's no additional district funding that's coming in for the amount.
Yeah.
So that's the only, when we made the existing position is only guaranteed at this point for, I believe, 2 more years. And the point was to use the actual money that was allocated in the grant for the position to pay out the cost for the position.
The difference, Kim is alluding to something that's correct, and so is Nakia. If you go now we're even going back even further. When we had a community relations person in our district who was full-time, she had an assistant, and when that position disappeared, the assistant was full-time, and this 21st century grant coordinator position came up. This person took the 21st century grant coordinator position. The grant only covered 4 days' worth of salary, and we weren't going to tell the person, you've worked 5 days a week, but now you're going to work 4 days a week. So we allowed them to work 5 days a week, 1 day still working with the communication and community relations office. Now, once the person went away, we didn't have the 5 days go away because that person still worked occasionally on Fridays at our district to do certain things. So when that person applied for the vacancy due to the resignation of someone, when we opened the 21st grant position again, we said, for now, since it's not an internal person that we have to cover in terms of 5 days versus 4 days or whatever else, we said we're going to allow the position to pay just what the grant is going to pay, and that's the salary you see posted.
Thank you. That's exactly what I remember. Thank you.
And that's full-time?
I believe that they're working full-time or, full-time.
Okay. Real quick, I guess my question would be, the new person that took over this position, what was their previous position? What is this person is the new?
She was new coming to the district. She had worked in the district at one point, but then she wasn't here recently, so she was coming back to the district.
Okay, so that person knows that this position could possibly be eliminated in 2 years.
Yes, that was made clear to her in the during the interview.
So the person that previously had this position has a position that's not in the grant, so to speak, temporary position.
Correct.
So that person knows that they have a little bit more security now, job security.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions? Do we have a motion and a second for the consent agenda? So would the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Stockton?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Mrs. Coletti?
Aye.
Mrs. Sanders?
Aye.
Secretary, aye. President Rose?
Aye. Consent agenda is approved. The next item we have on the agenda is the action reports. First item in the action reports is the adoption of the fiscal year 2012-2013 budget. So I'd like to get a motion to approve the presented fiscal year 12-13 budget as presented by Mr. Gruss earlier and noted in the agenda.
Move.
Moved by Mrs. Coletti,
Second.
second by Mr. Brown. Any questions or comments?
Oh, on the budget, Mark?
Yes.
Okay, I guess first I'm going to certainly say that I concur with you with regard to Bob's presentation, or Superintendent Gruss's presentation, and our previous workshop experience. As I said in the finance meeting, I was very pleased that this year we decided to take the proactive approach, albeit a little too late to make a lot of headway well, I'll get to that. But I just want to thank you, Bob, again, because there's a lot of information. I think I take this thing on the train. The paper is starting to curl up now, just from trying to get a sense of it. And it's not so much you talking it out to me or drilling it into any one individual. You know it, just like you said to the lady earlier. You could say it all night. At the end of the day, when I'm getting ready to vote on it, I need to know it, or at least feel comfortable with some of the things that are being, articulated to me. So I do want to thank you for that, and I certainly want to even give kudos to my colleague, Board Member Brown, just in regards to showing an important process in this, our board responsibilities, and coming up with reasonable suggestions, albeit to the tune of, what was it, like $275,000 in suggested savings. And it really just shows that if we put our heads together, as Dr. Rogers mentioned in the meeting a little earlier, that perhaps we may be able to make some substantial improvements in this process and really be the fiduciary responsible, not to say that we're not, but more responsible in this action, at least in a rigorous manner. So I just wanted to get that comment out. And so it's you've done a tremendous job in just outlining this information for lay people, and I definitely wanted to publicly commend you for that.
Any other comments?
I also wanted to say, just in case this wasn't mentioned tonight, but it is true that we, the last time we had a board workshop, I think almost all of our board members were able to come. I appreciate the board working together to advise the administration on such an important subject. Board Member Brown did bring a set of recommendations that the board, who was present that night, would 100% agreed that there ought to be some reductions in certain areas. We did make those reductions to the tune of $100,000 this year, with possible reductions for next year. We did ask the board if we could have some of these meetings just a little earlier, and they said they would do that. So I do want to let the board know that those reductions were made. There was a discussion about just not spending the money, and I later on just told Bob and the chairperson of the Finance Committee, we just need to reduce the numbers. Let's not keep it at one thing and just not spend it. Let's just reduce the numbers. That way the money doesn't exist to spend. So that's the way we handled it.
So it's not being sequestered, it's actually been
It's been subtracted.
subtracted.
Yes, and I felt that would be best, and the finance chair agreed with me after we had that discussion that it's just best to subtract the numbers, so we did do that.
I'm sorry, Dr. Rogers, did I overlook that, where you guys had finally made that determination?
Yeah, we did do that. It's in the legal budget, not the presentation tonight, but the one that's submitted to ISBE.
So that's why some of the numbers were different
Yes.
from,
Different.
okay, I was wondering that.
Right.
Well, again, I do want to say thank you for all the hard work that went into putting this budget together, from our business manager and all who had taken part in trying to make this happen. I do want to thank, Dr. Rogers for giving us another opportunity, the board, the entire board, another opportunity to look at the tentative budget and the board members that participated in it. I thought it was a lot of good input. But however, I still personally have some issues with the process that went forward, but I think things are going to get better. I hear it being communicated. But this budget that we are looking to vote on tonight is going to drive how the next few years is going to go with the budget to get us out of a deficit budget to a balanced budget. And I do have some concerns on how that's going to flow with the assumptions that's being put forth, with the assumptions that's being submitted to the state as far as our deficit budget reduction plan being presented to the state would be. I think these assumptions, again, are very, very optimistic, very liberal, but I think some rigor went into this budget. I think, going back, I thank you, Board Member Sanders, for, giving me kudos, but I think it's just my job to do that. And I just want to, in turn, thank you for looking at portions of the budget, specifically that of the technology that we said in a meeting a month or so ago, and you was able to garnish $150,000 in deductions from that particular part of the budget. So thank you, Board Member Sanders.
I have a comment. Well, first, thank you also, Bob, for your presentation. And anything about finances, if you're not a finance person, can, be hard to understand or, difficult, especially if we do have people, in the audience that don't deal with this on a regular basis. So I would make a suggestion for future budget presentations, as well as our academic presentations, that we provide a list of vocabulary that we can pass out to our public. And you hear words like levies and, things like that. Not everybody understands that, and we definitely want to make sure that we make things as clear as possible, clearly understood for all who are a part of the presentation. As far as the budget, I concur with Board Member Brown. I think that from here on out, we should be a little bit more careful as far as our projections. I think our audience member kind of alluded to it as well, just asking some of those questions, because those questions do need to be asked. If we're saying that our community is changing, we're talking about poverty levels, we're talking about the state may increase their funding for that, they may not. You know, a lot of this not really solid, not really a solidified way of knowing that we will get money that we're hoping, you know, to get or whatever. And again, so with that being said, I feel like we need to be a little bit more careful in our projections and what we're hoping to see come into the pot. But I do want to say, as far as with Dr. Rogers and making those cuts, because, you know, last I heard when we talked, they were not firm cuts. So to hear that now, the only thing with that is I wish the numbers that were presented tonight would have reflected that. I think that would have been better for us, and as far as in the presentation and understanding exactly where we stand in the district.
The numbers were actually, that's what I was looking at, the numbers were actually reflected tonight. I didn't know what the discrepancy, am I right, Bob?
Well, he was saying that
the
it's in the legal document, or was it on here?
What I presented ties to the legal doc. That was the legal budget. So all the cuts that were made are built into the legal budget. All those funds have been cut out of the budgets. It's not going to be spent. It's not in the legal budget, and that's reflected in the numbers that we saw.
So it was
there.
reflected tonight.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and, you know, it's very hard to distinguish where those dollars came from, because we're not looking at line item
Right.
per line item.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm looking at the budget that's being submitted to the state as opposed to what we have here. Those numbers is a little different, just a little bit. So,
No, it all ties to the penny. Which numbers are different?
Well, I remember 300,000 on this sheet for your office, and then it went to 292. I just assume now then.
I'm sure some of it's rounding too.
But, I mean, the statement, I guess, ultimately, if it's in there, but I was asking you if it had been, we never came back with the discussion. Last week, I heard it was sequester was which direction. It wasn't communicated.
Right.
Back down to us as to what, because I'm making a decision based on.
And that's what I was
some
saying, that
information.
wasn't communicated.
What wasn't communicated?
Just the fact that those are solid numbers now. Those budget cuts were not sequestered, that they were actually made.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we wanted to communicate that tonight in terms of
I
just
thought
making
that was
sure.
decided at the-
I wanted to make sure that that statement was made prior to a vote, because I wanted the board to know that Tom Heisel and myself did discuss the fact that I felt, to be honest with you, I just felt that I didn't agree with sequestering, you know, the budget and all. I just said, we're going to make the cuts. We're going to have the meetings with the administrators, which we did. We passed out and emailed new budgets to every cost center that had been reduced. I have administrators here to witness to 2 of those meetings, because we had one at central office and we had one with the principals. So they know that those meetings took place. They know that those emails were sent out. And I told Bob to have those numbers reflected in the budget, what those cuts were, not to leave it still inflated by $100,000, but to show the difference, that there should be a $100,000 difference. But like you said, Board Member Brown, it would be difficult with a legal budget this long to try to find every variance from any previous numbers you've seen, because then you'd have to try to add it up.
sure.
And without some sort of red flag by where, because some cuts were as small as $100. So, you know, trying to add all that up, but
It'd be very difficult.
yeah, I'm just telling you that I know we made the cuts, and I told Bob to have it reflected in the legal budget that would be submitted to the state.
Oh, okay, so I'm looking on page 50 of 68. Just if you can clarify this a little bit, Bob, and the handout that you sent, had given us on the first page there. The deficit on the handout that you gave us was $4,091,515. But the addendum, I'm probably looking at something wrong here, but I need clarification. The addendum is showing a different number for the budget. So if you can clarify that. We're showing $4 million that's being submitted to the state, $4,026,000. So I just want to make sure that this should reflect what's being submitted to the state. So just make sure.
Mr. Brown, you need to show us a little bit more by line items or something like that.
No,
what
it's
you're
just,
talking about.
2022. So make sure I understand
Fiscal year
that
12,
number
13.
and this number. What am I seeing wrong here?
This,
There's got to be something
what
I'm
you're
seeing here
looking at
wrong.
Here is
Mhm.
the deficit reduction plan,
Okay.
which excludes the IMRF fund, which is included here.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
So if you go towards the front on the budget summary page,
Mhm.
you'll see. it
The
breaks it
same
down-
numbers?
Yeah, it breaks it down by fund. Because
Okay.
that's not really, I mean, that's the deficit reduction plan.
Okay, and you do not include the IMRF?
No.
Okay.
They combine as ed fund, O&M, transportation.
Okay, that's what I said.
So yeah, so if
So,
you see it's those
let's
three
go back.
funds, it's actually these four funds, and you'll notice that it's excluding IMRF, because they're not interested in that for deficit reduction plan.
Okay,
So when you add those four together on here, that would be the same.
that'll be the same number?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, just need a clarification on that. All righty.
Can you explain that
And one other thing, Bob, that
outwardly?
you did mention in your presentation about the state as far as the proration. We're at 89%, I believe now. At first, we projected like 85%, but we got a little bit more for the budget reduction plan to obtain, eventually get to where we are going to have a balanced budget in year 15, 16, Y15, 16. You're taking into consideration 100% proration for at least 2 years, right? Something like that?
We said that next year, they would prorate at 90%, and then it would go to 95% the year after, and then by FY16, it would be at 100%, which that's being optimistic.
Very optimistic.
But to offset that, to balance that out and be more conservative with this, is at the same time, I also assume that the foundation level wouldn't be increasing either. So that's saying that it's been frozen for 4 years and it's going to be frozen for 4 more years. So it'd be 8 years of a frozen foundation level. I would say it's
Is that
likely
the
that
6119? Is that what
they
you
would
call
have
it?
to increase it at some point in the future. So, I mean, I guess the thing is with the 5-year forecast, you have to make, I mean, probably more than this, but major assumptions. I mean, there's hundreds of assumptions you must make. But the really critical assumptions, I would say there's 10 to 15 critical assumptions you have to make for a forecast. Because you have to just try and guess what's going to happen over the next 5 years with the state, federal, local governments. So what I do is I talk to our assessors, I talk to other business managers, I talk to people at the state. We go the seminars we go to, the conferences we go to, the things I read every day. You start to get a feel for what might happen, what could happen. What is in general, what are people assuming? And then at the same time, you want to be conservative with it, and you put all those projections in place. And then we talked about it in April. We talked about it again in May, again in June, where I disclose. And at every time I present the 5-year forecast, I say, these are the assumptions I'm making here. So it's important that the board understands the assumptions and agrees with the assumptions. If you disagree with an assumption, just let me know. I can go change it. But based on what we've seen and trying to be reasonable and conservative going forward, what would be a reasonable and conservative estimate of what might happen? What we can't do is be overly pessimistic and say, well, the state's just going to prorate general state aid 10%. They're never going to raise foundation level. Let's assume that everything's just going to go wrong, and you'll be projecting a $6 million deficit every year into the future. And if you look at that, what's going to happen is, you know, your only answer then is to say, well, we have to cut $6 or $7 million out of the budget next year. And so now we're going to decimate the whole district. We're going to lay off 200 employees. We're going to cancel every program. We're going to do all, and if you do all that, and then we end up having a $5 million surplus the next year, and then now you got to add it all back, and you know, you'd be taking things out and putting things back in, and the whole district would just be in turmoil. So you have to, you don't want to be overly optimistic, but you can't be overly pessimistic either. And I think that based on our 5-year forecast that we have, I think it's as conservative and realistic as possible, and I try to not be overly optimistic, but at the same time, we can't assume that the state is going to freeze the foundation level forever and permanently prorate general state aid. We could make that assumption. If we truly believe that's what they're going to do, and we believe that today, then we should be taking action today to counteract that. But I think there's still time to wait and see what's going to happen before. You don't want to overreact and make the wrong decisions now. Unless if you truly believe that that's what's going to happen, then we need to be coming up with contingency plans to deal with that. But that's why in all of our projections, I always very clearly, there's always a summary sheet of all of what our assumptions are. And I always put on the bottom that these are the assumptions. We all have to agree to these assumptions and then move forward with that. And if someone doesn't agree with the assumption, we'll be doing a 5-year forecast here in the next couple months. As soon as we get this legal budget set and we get going into this fiscal year, we're already going to be looking at next fiscal year and projecting what's going to happen next year. So the only advice I can give moving forward is that we discuss those assumptions more detailed, and if there's any assumptions that anyone's not comfortable with, we could even have alternative scenarios that say, well, this is optimistic, this would be pessimistic, this is most likely. We could run 5, 6 scenarios on these things. So I think it's important to say, well, what if the state didn't stop phasing out general state aid, and what does that look like? Well, then you're going to see that the deficit's not going to go away, or you know, things like that.
Yeah, and again, you know, I think for the most part you've taken somewhat a realistic approach, but with all of the uncertainties that the state, I mean, you have conveyed that information in pretty good details, and you was very passionate and animate about the uncertainties that the state have put forth over the last couple of years. And I think things are going to get worse before they get better. We haven't even talked about the lack of transportation funds that may be not coming our way, I guess. We haven't talked about in great details the retirement that we may be responsible, teachers' retirement, pension that we may be responsible. I know we can't act upon that in great details, but that should be considered, and I hope you kind of considered that when this budget was put together. So again, my issue is something that, again, we have control over. That's a big factor when the state determines how much money they're going to give to the district. That's the ADA, the average daily attendance, which we have some control over to a certain extent. And I don't know where we are with that. How far did that go into the budget as far as projection, 91%, 92%? Are we looking to increase that?
Because what's really important to understand is that the legal budget for 2013 that we have to vote on tonight, general state aid, it's not a projection. It's a definite number.
I agree. I agree.
So
with
the
you
numbers
100%.
in this year
Those numbers are done.
They're actuals that we know. It's just the 5-year forecast that we're looking at is where you have to, I mean, you got to project 4 years into the future what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So you have to make assumptions.
I want to reiterate that, you know, to all of the board members is that the budget that we vote on an annual basis, back to that idea of a checking account and a savings account, is if you want to look at the analogy of the checking account, that's based on real numbers this year that aren't projections at all. They're based on the numbers that were given to us from the state or the county when it comes to revenue. It's pretty solid, the taxes that we know that we're going to get or the state aid we're going to get at least for this year. I do agree that, well, I'm not going to say necessarily I agree. I understand the point of the idea of not overestimating in our assumptions for the future because there's too many things that are out there, and maybe, you know, there are some board members that feel that the assumptions are sort of on the high end. I would agree to this point that come second quarter of the year, or, you know, the beginning of the new calendar year, I think a lot of the mystery and clouds surrounding the future of finances in the state is going to be revealed, and I don't think it's going to be so much rosy projections as much as the realities of what's going to happen as it relates to pension reform and some of the other things that Bob mentioned. But that's good because that will be just in time for next year as we create the budget for next year and a new 5-year forecast. So I think for now, right now, just this period of 6 months probably, I think we are in good shape with both our assumptions and the real budget. I think come January, February, March, when I said that's when we'll have to talk about budget again, we'll probably be in the throes or the beginning throes of negotiations also with our union, our major union. The reality of what it is that we need to do or should do will be a reality, and our feet will be tightly to the ground and not in a cloud as to the decisions that we're going to be faced and the decisions that we're going to have to make collectively as a board and an administration. So trust me, the reality of what you're talking about is going to become very real between January and April of next year. But the budget you're going to pass tonight is based on real projections, real figures, actuals versus projections.
And I just wanted to clarify, too, that in the 5-year forecast that we had, and, you know, we presented, it was in May and June again, it's on board book, where I had recommended certain recommendations where saying if we don't do anything and just rely on that general state aid increasing and the taxes increasing and all that stuff kind of just taking care of itself, how it sort of levels the budget out and it basically balances it, but it's not a huge surplus like you saw. But then that's why I had recommended some specific actions to take over the next couple fiscal years, that if you look at if you do that, then you're talking about in FY16 a $3.4 million surplus. Now, part of the reason why I would recommend something like that is not necessarily just to have a huge surplus in FY16, but if you do those things and some of those other things don't pan out like you thought, well then your projection of 3.4 might actually just become a balanced budget. But I mean, in my recommendations, in our 5-year forecast, we have the base scenario where you kind of just don't make any changes and let general state aid and all that increase and take care of itself over time, which would just barely balance the budget. But I say, I mean, I've said my recommendation to the board was to follow those suggestions that we had listed out and talked about in the finance committee meeting, to overshoot it and have surpluses projected, so that in case some of those things don't go right, you're still at a balanced budget. It's just, it'd be nice to have the large surplus, but odds are everything's not going to go perfectly, so you're going to want some cushion there.
And Bob, I want to thank you for your meticulous, always meticulous attention to detail and knowing what you're talking about. And I think as a board, we have the hardest job because we are committed to making sure that our district is financially responsible. And we also have the goal, ultimately, of having a balanced budget again. But the reality of it is our major objective, our major purpose is to educate the children of the district. Unfortunately, in today's climate, in the state of our state, our finances, our economy, we cannot do that. There's no quick fix to this. And if we were to say today, Maurice, okay, this is it. Today's the day, we're making all these cuts. The budget's going to be balanced tomorrow morning. Who suffers? The kids suffer. And I think that's why I appreciate Bob's thoughtful attention to this and all of the board members who participate in this process in arriving at something that is moving toward that goal without decimating our purpose, which is to educate the children.
Oh, I agree with you,
So,
Board
thank
Member
you.
Coletti. I agree with you 100%, and I never at any point, and I think I might have made this be known to the public and the board member, and I'm passionate about not cutting teachers, not cutting staff. You know, you guys, before I came on board, you went through that process, and all I'm saying is that we look at everything outside that doesn't directly have an impact on the learnings of our children. Have we did our due diligence to ensure that we are efficient, that we are proper with putting the proper dollars to the proper program? That's all.
Yeah, and I think we have made a major step in doing that, and that we see that it is not an overnight fix. It's something that is going to take a couple of years. But then if, you know, we have to rely on his expertise. Who am I, or anybody else on this board, really, to think that our assumptions, you know, would ever match up to his expertise?
And exactly, but it's things that, again, and I'm going to leave it at this, at least on my part, it's things that we as a board, we can ensure ourselves that we are doing the right thing by asking the right questions that we have a control over, like ADA. We have a control, we have somewhat of a control of that process, that we are at least doing what we need to do to make that number go up. We have a direct impact on obtaining the activity fees. That's a big gap there that we have not been able to obtain and get a control of that process as well. We have another direct impact on a big ticket item, books that's being lost, that's being tore up, that we haven't obtained those fundings like we are to. I'm talking about $1 million+ just those 3 line items. All other things being said, yes, Bob, you are the expert. That's what we hired you to do. You do a good job at that. I have no problem with that. You communicate very well. You're very smart. I wish I was as smart as you. So keep doing what you're doing. But we as board members are stewards of the finance, and we need to continue to oversee the process.
And Nancy, I don't think that that there's no question about Bob's expertise. I think we just went over and over about saying we're supportive of his diligence. But, you know, case in point, I'm thinking about being in a finance meeting and having said the same thing I'm saying today and the same thing I'm going to continue to say. I still said we should be more reserved in our purse straps, simple and plain. There's a poverty line. I shared it with Dr. Rogers. The average person who wasn't before considered or categorized as poverty or in the poverty line is now being categorized as such in two income homes. That's changing. So, Bob, although, as you stated several times, you've made your assumptions in the finance meetings, and again, it's a board, it's a process, so some people didn't agree with that. I'm here to say I certainly am. I'm being consistent. I didn't agree, not against, and that's what this is. This is not about judging his expertise. It is that we do have the responsibility of asking the question, or for that matter, just simply stating that there is we can respectfully disagree with the process, and at the end of the day, we're going to have to make a decision. But I don't think, and I'll say this right now, my decision is not based on, because I didn't get ample information from Bob, but there are a variety of factors that are affecting my vote tonight, and that has nothing, or it doesn't have a big thing to do with Bob, and I don't want to be apologetic for it at all, because his information included with to his own admittance and everybody's admittance, there are a lot of other things that we can do that were not necessarily readily accepted in our finance meeting. So I'm just one person, and anybody else is just one person, but that affects individuals.
Oh, most definitely, and I think that's what we've talked about, is making cuts, taking money away from certain budgets, and I think we have accomplished that. What I'm saying is that personally, this is my personal feeling, I rely on Bob, the financial expert's assumptions, which are not just based on, to my knowledge, something Bob is pulling out of his, trick bag. As he said, he is up on all of the literature. He's up on talking to his peers in the same field, his co-professionals. He has his hand, I think, on the pulse of what is going on in school financing, in budget reform, in state aid payments. And I'm saying personally, I am relying on his representation. That's all I'm saying. I don't, it's not up to me to decide what any other board member relies on. But I'm saying I'm relying on Bob's assumption. I am in no position to make any assumptions about forecasts regarding what the state is going to pay in the future or not pay.
Let me just make a comment here to try to tie everything up here and try to move along a little bit. I appreciate everybody's comments like that. And just as a start, this isn't Bob's budget. This is the district's and administration's budget. There's been a lot of administrators, principals, assistant principals, everybody that deals with any kind of spending of dollars has submitted what they need to educate our students for next year to help Bob and the administration put together some reasonable numbers. In a private sector and stuff, you have accountants and actuaries and everybody else that go through those numbers and make recommendations to boards or CEOs and things like that to try to put together what we're doing here and stuff. I think that, if we had a magical crystal ball where we could see what was going to happen next year or what the state's going to do next year, it'd make things so much easier. It would have made things so much easier 2 years ago if we could have seen the economy fall out too. Unfortunately, hindsight's great, and the crystal ball isn't simply out there. So we have to make some assumptions based on reasonable expectations from competent people that we're listening to and making judgments for as to where we want to go with this budget, consideration. And there's other things too that, use that same kind of philosophy as far as education, maintenance of buildings, where we're going with personnel, things like that. So it's not only the budget like that, And what I'm saying, what I would like to end with is, if we do have differences of opinion, we should bring these things together and talk about these things so that they can be resolved. We also need to do that on a timely basis and do that through the process. We've been developing the budget since February, I want to say, last year, and we've had finance meetings. We've talked about this stuff at every finance meeting. We've had board meetings. We can set up, individual appointments to go and talk with Bob or any of the administrators about the finance or anything else in there and stuff like that. So, please make yourselves available and do that kind of thing and clear whatever questions that you do have. I don't want to have anybody come away from a vote or whatever and stuff and feeling that they didn't have all of the information they need in order to make an intelligent decision. So, with that in mind and stuff, does anybody have any other questions in regards to the budget here that we need to have answered yet this evening? No? If not, we do have a motion on the table and a second to approve and adopt the fiscal year 2012-2013 budget as presented. So would the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Stockton? Aye. Mr. Brown?
Nay.
Mrs. Coletti?
Aye.
Mrs. Sanders?
Nay.
Secretary abstain. President Rose?
Aye. By a vote of 3-2 with one abstention, the budget has passed, unless we have a legal discrepancy here that we need to address, something like that. But majority of the quorum and the adoption of the 2013 budget is approved. Moving on to the next item that we have on the agenda is Superintendent Informational Report regarding AP testing requirements. Dr. Rogers?
Yes. Hold on just a second, I gotta get to the page.
62.
62, thank you.
And before we really get to that, does anybody really need to, let's take 5? Everybody take 5, we'll come back and then hopefully finish this up very quickly. 5 minutes.
Is it one over here near something?
This one.
It's not like a real popular name. Julie came up with it. I was like, I can't think of anybody I know named Laney. I don't know one Laney. Yeah. Laney. Lane Bryant.
Right, that's it. Yeah, I see what that was close.
And that's a clothing store, right?
That's close. It's probably a man, too.
That might be.
But years ago in Crete, you may remember that. No, it was before I came back home. Denise Esterwald and was named Laney Lowe.
Laney Lowe?
Laney Lowe. She was this tiny, teeny, pudgy little girl with blonde hair. She was hysterical. She was just that's the only Laney Lowe.
bunch of copies in there.
Somebody that must have thought our meeting was lasting until 12.
List extension. I guess you just don't.
We know,
Doesn't
I think he just probably,
Okay,
because I think it's just a, yeah.
right. Right, so, okay, then she just said we need to do it.
Terry, I still do need the secretary to sign on certain
What?
line items.
You need what?
The certification document requires the secretary's
Right,
signature,
right.
because as represented with the board voting.
Yeah, I came to your office, anyway, yeah, she'll sign it even because she abstained. She'll sign it.
Like the, yeah, for the resolution, the certificate.
Right.
Oh, that's odd.
It doesn't.
These glasses every day.
You know,
Okay, I think we're working on getting,
one thing we didn't bring up,
I think there's 4 or 5 copies, and each of you need to sign in the appropriate column, with the exception of Kia.
yeah, we got, just for the members' information here, the packet over there has paperwork that needs to be signed because of the budget, so you need to put your signature on what you voted for. There's a yay and a nay, and I think for Nakia being an abstention on there, that she does not have to sign it. So it'll be coming around, so before you leave, you need to sign the paperwork, unless you want to come and see Terry tomorrow. Okay? I think everybody else is back here. We'll begin then, turn it over to Dr. Rogers then for the AP testing information, so.
Okay, this is an information report only. I'm sort of seeking suggestions from the board. I'm not asking you to have any action on this, but here's the issue. We have a new principal, as you well know, at the high school, and through research and analysis of test scores and looking at different groups, there was then something that he discovered through the curriculum office, Laura working with him, that we thought was worthy of your attention. The issue is that we have AP classes. I think we have, don't hold me to it, it's later in the report. I think there's 8 of them altogether. And what's been put into the academic guide and course manual for both students and parents is that there should be an AP exam that's taken by students at the end of that course. It's a standardized test that's actually administered by the College Board. And the purpose for the test is twofold. One is a child has a chance to actually earn college credit by scoring a 3 or higher on the test. The scale is a scale of 1 to 5, and if you score a 3 or higher, 3, 4, or 5, most colleges, at least in Illinois, will accept the AP class as if you had taken the course on their campus. The second issue is that it is a way for us to evaluate the program. If you can get 100% participation of kids taking that exam, we have, it serves as sort of an outside proctor or third party, sort of a validation to whether or not kids have actually learned the content to the level of proficiency that they should. Although we could look at grades and just be satisfied with that, the AP college exam sort of is the ultimate in saying that the College Board themselves say the child has proficiently learned that course enough that we're going to give them a number that even colleges will recognize that they have earned, college credit. The problem is that although we put this in and we could even add it to the fee courses as far as the slip at registration, I believe that it costs about $90 per exam. So if you have children registered in multiple AP courses, it could add up very quickly. Usually you don't find too many students that have more than 3 AP courses at one time, but that's close to $300 in exams. And if you look at page 63, you'll see that there's a comparison of the number of AP students in our high school that have scored 3 or above in exams over the years, which has been declining actually since 2007, and with the state is maintained pretty much at about 65 to 67% of kids in Illinois who take AP classes score 3 or higher. On page 64, you can see the exam by subject area, and again, the idea is to get a 3. You can see where the state has pretty much, they're either close to 3 or right under 3, and our high school is somewhere between about 2.5 is probably our average for most of our courses, with a few exceptions. The last page, or not the last page, but page 65 gives you some numbers of the number of kids enrolled in these courses versus the number of kids who are tested. And again, in 2011, only half the kids took the AP exam. Last year we did have an uptick up to 61%, but again, when you get down to the actual courses, when you see in this email, let's just take, for example, well, I don't even have to go to that email. If you stay up where you see the 2011-2012 box, that in one course, which it was AP Lit, there was only 13 kids enrolled, only 3 kids took the exam. Environmental Science, 14 kids enrolled, again, only 3 kids took the exam. Macroeconomics, 10 kids enrolled, only 2 kids took the exam, and so on. It's sort of tough to determine how well the class did when only 20% of the kids take the exam. So on page 66, we just wanted to show you that it is in writing, that AP classes, it does say that all AP, there's a prerequisite to get into the course, and then it says all AP students are required to take the AP exam in the spring, and the fee is approximately $90. And then the last page was a proposal from Mr. Dugan of things that we can do to bring more rigor to the set of courses, and we wanted to require that students take the exam or they would not get AP credit in the sense of AP weight. First of all, they wouldn't get AP credit because if you can't take the exam and get the college credit without taking the exam. The second issue is what he was suggesting is that the course would drop down to an honors weight course rather than an AP weight. Now, I thought personally that was actually a fair way to put pressure on people and still not take away the course or the grade away from the child, because we're not kicking them out of the class. Right. We're saying you can still remain in the class, you can still take the course, you'll still get a grade. It's just if you don't take the exam, 2 things happen. You don't have a chance, obviously, to get the college credit, and the second thing is that we're not going to give you the AP weight. When our attorneys looked at this, however, and this is new since this report was written, they told us that although there's no exact code that would say that that's not legal, but they said it would be challenged in terms of any time that you take things possibly away from kids, even though it's just a weight. If something is riding on the line in terms of valedictorian or class rank, or could be a multitude of things, it could still be legally challenged to the point that you may not win the fight legally if it comes to a legal battle. So the recommendation that he had put in here, which was probably, I think, number 3, that, or number 4, to put a deposit down for the test, and then the last sentence, failure to make the deposit will result in the course having a regular honors weight rather than the AP weight, has been struck down by our attorneys. So the reason why I'm even bringing this to you is because it puts us in a dilemma that we have a requirement that's in our book where we're saying if you take an AP course, you should take the AP exam. In fact, we're not saying should, we're saying it's required. But our attorneys are saying there's no way that you can legally enforce that. But I'm saying as superintendent to you is that we need to have 100% participation of students taking the exam to give them, first of all, the benefit of hopefully earning college credit, but second of all, for us to have a more solid way of evaluating the course. So what it boils down to, no matter what you feel about it, it's still my opinion, and that is that I think we're going to have to look at, do we, if we're going to offer AP courses, that I think we have, our attorney has put us in a situation that we probably need to consider paying for the AP exam for kids who enroll in the class. Because if we don't do it, all I'm saying is, if we don't do it, it's just going to remain as it is now, which will mean that our AP mean scores are always going to be low because we don't have every kid taking the class, so we don't look good in comparison to the state because everybody's not taking the AP exam. And we have no real way of knowing what kids know other than their grades. And I'm not saying that grades aren't valid measures of something, but they're not the measure that I think we need to look for when it comes to AP. I think you do need that outside validating source that says, not just that the teacher says they know the material, but the college board says that they know the material. I've done an estimation. If we were to pay for kids who enroll in the course, it would be anywhere from 14 to depending on enrollment in any given year, it could range from $14,000 to $20,000 a year. And that's very small compared to, you know, the larger budget, but it's something for tonight. I just want to hear your comments on, if you care to comment on that. Maybe I'm not thinking straight about this. Maybe there's something else that I haven't thought about that you can share with me to help me. But right now, I think that's the dilemma that we're in. It's either leave it alone and leave it the way it is, or the only way that you can get kids to comply, according to our attorneys, is that if you're going to offer it, you have to, and you make it mandatory that everybody has to take it, then you'll have to pay for that fee. Because other than that, you have to not make it mandatory and then just have it stay as it is. So.
John, isn't there a way to at least approximate what the actual AP test is in terms of measuring success in the course, measuring growth? I personally am opposed to mandating that all kids have to take the exam, and I am completely opposed to us subsidizing the cost of the test. We tonight could not even have a full board, you know, come to a resolution on the budget and on passing an unbalanced budget. And I just think to throw another, you know, it might seem like a minuscule amount in the scheme of things, but you're saying between 14 and 20, did you say, $1,000?
Yes, it would be that much. Yes, it would be.
I am wholeheartedly opposed to that. I think that if the teachers, I think I read something in these documents that there would be a requirement that within a certain amount of time of teaching an AP course, the teacher would have to obtain, additional certification or additional training in teaching AP. And I think if we can't rely on that and can't rely on classroom testing of some sort, devise some way of measuring success or growth in the class without forcing everybody to take this test, I think we need to look at that.
All right, that's why I asked. I asked your opinion.
Just my opinion.
I got it.
Any other comments from other board members?
I definitely, I remember you guys did it, an incentive, if you will, with the Excel Edge, where you paid, or either you paid half, and then if they finished or completed the process, then there was a reimbursement. But certainly at this state, I agree with Nancy, and probably with the average parent. I mean, you say $90 at how many ever kids is not conducive for our budget. I don't know that, people want well for their kids. It doesn't mean that they have the $90. But the other side of it is we've talked about, and I've heard Mike talk about when our kids leave this district, how we've all heard it, is the rigor of an AP course. It isn't deemed, apparently, equal to that of the colleges as is. So the question becomes again, so they took the class, and I guess to your point, the validation is not that Crete Monee said that you took an AP class. I've had several people to say that to me. I'm in AP classes, and I took them at Crete Monee, and then when I went to the college, it did not, make the mark as far as the rigor of it. So just because it's nothing against a teacher or anybody, it's not the same rigor or something that can be compared with in the real world. So it is although it's quite a dilemma. But the only other suggestion that I thought is always the encouragement, or it doesn't have to be monetary. Could we come up with something that encourages the students, some kind of, I'm thinking about Mr. Elrod's, don't get me wrong because I'm mixing up PBIS, but some sort of other classical incentive. I don't think you need to take much to get people to say, I'm sorry, your kid's going to be in an AP class, and this class is going to essentially tell the parents that they don't have to pay the college cost of a first semester class, let's just say in English. The difference between getting it for $90, let's just say at Crete, versus the first semester cost at a university is tremendous. So, but still finding some, I don't know, and I don't want to be minuscule in saying, Cougar, what are the dollars here? Warrior dollars,
yeah, Warrior.
But something that's not necessarily so monetarily vested, but something that we could do that they could earn it, perhaps, opposed to this kind of forced thought. That's my suggestion.
My question, just to gain clarity, is if we implement the exam, it has to be mandatory? Is that what we're saying, according to AP, the College Board?
No, the College Board isn't forcing, you to have, if you offer a course, the College Board is not saying you have to force kids to take the exam.
So we can make it optional for those that desire to take the exam?
It's optional now. What I was just stating is that when you look at these statistics that come back from the College Board in terms of our low, sometimes it's a very low number. It makes it look like that we're not in par or in line with other schools that offer AP classes in terms of the level of kids who score 3 or above are able to use the AP course to enter into college with college credit. And all I'm saying is that the way to resolve that is to bring our enrollment up or the amount of kids who actually take the test up higher. The number, I think, for the state, as far as the amount of kids who, well, it doesn't really say the amount of kids who take the test, but certainly the amount of kids who are scoring 3s and above is almost close to 70%, where ours is as low as 37%. And some of that is just based on the amount of kids who are taking the test. If you're basing your whole percentage on 2 versus 14, or a very low number versus a very high number, you have a better chance of showing better on these kind of reports when you have more kids taking the test. And we've tried, we have encouraged, we have informed, we've called parents. We might not have done incentives necessarily, but we certainly have informed, our parents and tried to convince them and the students that to us it just doesn't make a lot of sense, and again, it could be just my opinion, to go through everything that they go through in taking that course, doing all that extra work, and not take the test. They're missing out on a huge opportunity. What we're hearing a lot of is they just can't afford to take 2 and 3 exams at the cost of not having it subsidized. Now, I hear Nancy loud and clear, but I think all of you know me. I still bring what I think is important enough for the board to consider, even if your answer is no, because to me it's just put it out there for the record. And so for the record, you just need to see how we stand against the state. And I'm just saying, I think we've tried a lot of things. Maybe we haven't tried this incentive thing. We can go back to the drawing board and talk about that. But our scores look low, and part of it could be maybe the students aren't learning like they should, or it could be it's low because we just don't have enough students taking the test.
Yeah, because I think, because I've heard you say, other factors, but have we looked at how these teachers are teaching the subject matter?
That was my question too. The quality, we need to look, in my opinion, as a parent of someone who had 2 children take various AP courses, neither of them ever wanted to take the test. Didn't want to risk spending the money because they heard nobody ever gets a 3. And I think it's more of a question of the quality of the course that we're offering than it is of testing our, I think we need to look at the courses and the quality of instruction in those individual courses first, before we require our kids to, because I think, it could be a grand fail, and our scores would look even worse.
And then you just spent $90 for what?
Right.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and so I think what I'll do is we're going to implement everything else on this proposal that we can. We were going to do that anyway, because we do need to audit the instruction more. We need to require more of our teachers in terms of their own development, the time that they put in, and so on. And then I think when we get to a point where we feel extremely confident, maybe we'll just come back to you with revisit this subject again. Because I see the point that, okay, why force them? First of all, we're spending money. And then if kids feel like I'm not going to score a 3 anyway because they have doubts about what they've learned, that could be an issue. I don't know if that's true or not, as far as a generalization to make.
And I've heard that generally.
Yeah.
I've heard it.
I've heard it too as well. And again, this is from a personal experience. My daughter, one of my daughters, she had AP calculus, she had linear algebra all at the same time. And I believe her grade point average was like 4.8, 4.7. So she was right in the top 2 or 3 of her class. Now, I was very upset when she did not want to take the AP exam. I think it had a lot to do with money came up as an issue, even though it should not have. But she said she was just pretty much burnt out during that time, had a little senioritis. However, She was glad she did not take it because there was an option. She went to the University of Illinois, and they allow her to proficiency out of 4 classes, I believe, calculus, chemistry. So she got those credits anyway. So I don't know if we want to look and see if those exams that they give as proficiency exams kind of equals or kind of go along the same line as the AP exams, but that is an option that some kids may know about. So to have it mandatory for them to take the AP exam, and there's no consequences if they just sit there and turn in their paper at the end of the exam other than not obtaining a 3, but knowing that there's an option that they possibly could proficiency out of a class and get the credit anyway, that's something we may want to look at. But I agree with you 100%. Advanced placement improvement plan, that you're looking to improve the process, I agree 100%. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, they answer. I appreciate, I appreciate all your comments. I just needed to, sometimes you do need to have the board as a sounding device to put a problem out there and get your feedback, because many of you are parents, or you have had parent or children in the district, and so your input has been very helpful. I think I know what to do.
Ma'am,
John,
did
is
you have
there,
a question out there? Ma'am? Did you have a question out there? Can you hold?
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
thank you.
It looks like there's Todd. Do you want to accept him?
Yeah, take it.
Challenging.
Right. Right. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much. I think we've given Dr. Rogers some information that he can take back, and
I asked for it, too.
you got you. You got it.
Didn't I? You don't see me getting mad either, do you?
Okay. Let's see if we can get going here. And do we have any old business? Old business. No old business? Moving along here. Any new business?
You know what, President Rose, I'm not sure where to get this in at, but I'm going to bring it up, and you can knock me down if you need to. But I do want to talk about, further have some discussion when it comes to the overall safety program. I talked to Assistant Superintendent Elrod regarding a safety event that happened here on the school grounds not too long ago, but I was not comfortable with the process that was used to address that issue. So I don't know if we have a safety policy, but I want further discussion on that, and I don't know how to get it in.
I think the best way to do that is to, I think since you have issues with it, and then Mr. Elrod is kind of the liaison or the guy to talk to about that, meet with Mr. Elrod to try to resolve anything. If you can't get anything resolved or you need to have board discussions, I think Mr. Elrod can put it on the agenda and we can have it discussed, as an agenda item in the future, We don't
Okay.
know right now and stuff without spending,
Sure.
all
Absolutely.
kinds of time right
No,
now.
and
So
I-
trying to figure out what it is. But
Exactly.
I think if you two guys could work together and see what you can find out, what you need, what you want to see, that kind of thing and stuff, we can all discuss it and then bring it back and have,
Absolutely.
some discussions on it, so.
More to follow? More to follow? Okay.
I also have a comment about our bus transportation. For one, we've been in school about a month now, or over a month, and there are, I know personally in my neighborhood, some buses that are still significantly late picking up the children to the point where it's after school start time. So I don't know if you know of any issues with that. This is for CSK children. So I would like to get some information on that. Also, another safety issue with me being concerned about the bus drivers when they pick the children up. If you have a child that's clearly in view, I've seen this a few times, where the bus drivers, if you're not standing at the corner, will continue to drive and not stop at the corner if a student is approaching the corner. And I see kids running after the buses, and then the drivers just keep going. To me, that's a safety issue, especially if a kid decides to dart out into the street just basically trying to catch a bus. So I wanted to communicate that with you as well. So if we can look into those two issues, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Hall, if you could give George after the meeting, if you just happen to know route numbers or the location of the stops, that would be helpful in him being able to track down a more detailed answer in terms of actual drivers and routes. If you can do that, I appreciate it.
Any other new business from anybody? I know that, excuse me, there was an email that went out in regards to trying to get some additional dates for IASB workshops that Terry has submitted, I think, to everybody. So if you'd please reply to her with some kind of dates or your availability. I don't know where that's.
We have not heard back from our IASB field director to his availability, so I thought I would wait until I heard from him, and then I can just send everybody a table, and you can just fill it in with an X if you're not available,
Okay.
or an A if you're not available.
If you want to send Terry your availability, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll wait until we find out from her, what his availability is. So, we'll continue with that stuff. But trying to coordinate everybody's schedule can be somewhat difficult as we're coming into the holidays. So, any other new business? If not, a motion to adjourn. Moved by Mrs. Coletti.
Second.
Second by Mr. Brown. All those in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Abstentions, none. We are adjourned.